Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Gardels. I'm a co-founder of the Berggruen Institute and editor of Noema magazine. This conversation is called The New Frontiers of Digital Democracy. Our guest today is Audrey Tang, the Digital Minister of Taiwan, coming to us from Taiwan. You can follow us on #AthensDemocracy. Audrey, let me just make a few comments first, and then I'll ask you to tell us what you're up to in Taiwan and how interesting it is. I would just like to frame the discussion by talking about the topic of this whole conference is that democracy across the West is in various stages of implosion. In the US in particular, we're in the midst of a bitter cultural and political civil war driven by the participatory power of social media. In that context, elections in which partisans vie for power by any means necessary only deepens divisions. One way out of such polarization is to invite the broader civil society into governance through new institutions that encourage and enable negotiation and compromise to reach consensus. Mending the breach of distrust between the institutions of self-government and the public in this way can be called participation without populism. What that means is integrating social networks and more direct democracy into the system through new deliberative institutions that complement representative government. Since social networks have drawn more players into the political fray than ever before, never has the need been greater for a counterbalance of impartial practices and institutions to sort out the cacophony of voices, the welter of conflicting interest, and the deluge of contested information. Deliberative democracy is when a group of citizens, indicative of the public as a whole, is brought together in a neutral, nonpartisan space, listens to facts by experts, deliberates choices, which then inform the actions of governments, parliaments, public referenda, citizen movements. To borrow a phrase from the COVID crisis, deliberative democracy is an anti-inflammatory therapeutic for the body politic. Now, the best examples of this recently have been in Ireland. There was a citizens' assembly that addressed the highly controversial issue in a Catholic nation of abortion. Even more recently, in France, in the wake of the Yellow Jacket uprising, the Citizens' Convention on Climate was assembled to address climate and to propose policies in a way that took into account the concerns of the average citizen. At the end of that process, President Macron said that this process shows that even on the most controversial and flammable issues, consensus can be reached. Now, earlier today at this conference, Yuval Harari made the point that one of the most enduring consequences of the COVID crisis is a decisive shift to the digital society. Everything will have to adapt, including deliberative democracy. And your work in Taiwan has been going on for many years. You're really on the frontier of deliberation, online deliberation. So what I'd like to ask you to do is explain to people who don't know, which is many people, what you do, what the process is, and its impact on Taiwan.
Certainly. So to people who are not versed or do not have a first-hand experience of deliberative democracy, I usually just speak in simple words. Deliberative democracy, like 2 many syllables. I usually just say our system is to make participation fast, fair, and fun. And that's it. And so I'll use some examples. The fast part basically says the government needs to respond in the here and now when the citizens have an agenda to make. And just using COVID as an example, last December, when Dr. Li Wenliang from Wuhan, from PRC, posted on their social media that there is, and I quote, 7 new SARS cases, unquote, immediately gets noted and reposted in Taiwan to the PTP. Now, PTP is the kind of institution, it's run by the National Taiwan University, maintained entirely by volunteers, So it's in the social sector. It's open source, not for profit, not funded by advertisements. So not only is they the first institution to sign on the Counter Disinformation Accord a couple years ago, but also the place where people go to for breaking news like this. So people upvoted on PTT. So our medical officers immediately started health inspections for all incoming flights from Wuhan the very next day. And this is Dr. Li Wenliang's post being reposted on the PTT. And then this says to me two things. First, because Taiwan is, according to the Civicus Monitor, the only place in Asia, the only country in Asia that has a completely open civil society in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of press and so on. So people feel free to talk about and triage, basically, about the evidence that is posted by Dr. Li Wenliang. And second, that the CECC, our Central Epidemic Command Center, trusted this collective intelligence very quickly and set up a toll-free number, a landline, that's 1922, that everybody can call. Of course, there's more digital ways such as chatbots and so on, but the easiest to access one is just a toll-free phone number that everybody can call and ask their questions about COVID and get a real-time response from the scientists. And also, when there's a new idea from the society, it escalates very quickly into the daily press conference. For example, back in April, there was a young boy who called saying, "I don't want to go to school. You're rationing masks, and I all get is pink medical masks." And my classmate may laugh at him, he said. And so the very next day, everybody in the live stream CECC press conference, including our Minister for Health, Chen Shizhong, wore pink medical mask. I think Minister Chen even said Pink Panther was his childhood hero or something. So the boy became the most hip boy in the whole class because only he has the color that the medical officers, the heroes, wear. And so that's radically trusting the citizens. And the iteration cycle, that is to say the response cycle, measured in hours, is very, very important because only then will the citizens get the agenda setting power that is the beginning of each and every deliberative space. It's also important that when we're delivering what the citizens want, we make sure that people can audit it in a very interactive way. For example, in the beginning, around February, when we're ramping up the production of medical masks from 2 million a day to 20 million a day in a country of 23 million people, we work with 6,000 pharmacists across the island, and each and every one agreed to display their mask availability. So when I click on the map here, I see the real-time numbers of all the adults and children's masks, their opening hours, and things like that. And so the civic technologists volunteer to create a map that I showed you, which spread to South Korea and so on, because it's open source. So everybody queuing in line can check after just 30 seconds at a time. For everyone queuing before them, once they finish a purchase, the number will go down by 9 for 2 weeks if you're an adult, or 10 if you are a child. Again, if there's anything going wrong with the system, if people see the number rather increase, they will call 1922 right there. And so the civic technologists, more than 140 teams of them, of course, didn't appear out of nowhere. They appear because, and I here quote our president, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, 4 years ago in her inauguration speech. She said, before, we think of democracy as a showdown between two opposing values. But now democracy must become a conversation between many diverse values. So she initiated many deliberative spaces, including the presidential hackathon.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about
that. In which people across the country are free to propose anything that forms what we call a data collaborative. It may be people measuring air quality together, like primary school people, like people learning about data stewardship, data competence. We don't use the term literacy in Taiwan, competence, producing data and media to detect air quality issues, water quality issues, repair the pipes together, and so on. Many interesting ideas around climate change, especially this year, and the top 5 teams of those civic technologists, after we coached them to be trilingual, that is to say, including public, private, and social sector participants, receive a trophy every year. So the trophy, which is handed out to 5 teams every year, when you turn it on, it's a micro projector. It again shows the president handing you the trophy, saying that whatever you did in the past 3 months will become public policy, national policy, with all the personnel, budget, and regulatory changes required in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
So that's presidential executive power with its own regulation written into the institution that we bind ourselves to whatever is co-created across the 3 sectors, as long as they correspond to the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. And so that shows the importance of a fair kind of binding power in academic speech in deliberative spaces. But when we say if the society likes the idea, what does that mean even? So we use a AI-powered conversation tool called Polis. And by AI, I mean assistive intelligence. And nowadays, it even has its own website at polis.gov.tw. A recent consultation we just did about ocean policy can be accessed at polis.gov.tw/ocean. So it's now part of our government institution. It was first used in 2015 when we deliberated about UberX. At the time, as you can see, all my Facebook friends and Twitter friends are all over the place when it comes to positions regarding the UberX practice. At the time, they were working with drivers with no professional licenses. And so we used a focused conversation method where we crowdsourced the facts, the objective parts from the sectors, published it for all to see. But critically, we built our own social media entry point. Instead of the anti-social media that divides people, we built a pro-social media interface that asks only, what do you feel about UberX? What do you feel about the situation, about the shared fact? And that's often missing from policy making. And on this online space, people are asked to write down statements that reflect their feelings. And we make a face-to-face, but also live-streamed meeting at the end of the consultation about feelings. And the agenda is set entirely by feelings that people feel that resonate with one another. So the best ideas are the ideas that take care of people's feelings. And each feeling may be simple ones, like I feel that passenger liability insurance is very important. And if you agree, you move closer to me. If you disagree, your avatar will move away from me.
Okay.
So that's how the system works. But there is no reply button. So there is no room for troll to grow. If there's a reply button to personal attacks, the distractions, I don't know, pictures that make people angry will dominate the discussion. But because there's no reply button, if you don't feel like pressing agree or disagree, you can also share what you feel and for other people to vote whether they resonate with you or not. And every time we run such a Polis conversation, starting from UberX in 2015, followed by Airbnb and drunk driving, and followed by even the hiking, mountaineering, ocean policies, even diplomatic policies like the US-Taiwan digital dialogue. We use Polis for that too. Every time, regardless of the topic, you see that this shape, and this may be the most important slide I'm going to show in this session. This is the shape of the polity. The usual divisive issues, ideological issues are there, but people do not spend a lot of time on it. Rather, people see that they actually agree with most of their neighbors most of the time on most of the issues. And this is not something particular to the country of Taiwan, but rather this ship is actually from Bowling Green, from Kentucky. And regardless of whether people feel Republican or Democrat, they all agree that the arts are important in science, technology, engineering, and math education. That is to say, they need to be made STEAM, not just STEM, because the creativity is the same with making creative art and creative technologies. And this is interesting because it simply doesn't get much press at all in either institutional media or in social media before. But once people understand their polity after all, it enabled face-to-face deliberations to basically use those consensus as the measures of progress. And then we can just call it a rough consensus and innovate based on those common values. So that's the basic intuition of how it works if I'm going to explain to people who have not participated in deliberative democracy spaces.
Thank you. Let me ask you, you said in the beginning that participation only works if there's a real impact on power. So take the Uber example. Maybe you said this and I didn't hear it, but when you had the Uber discussion and consensus, and the reason I ask this is in California right now, we are having this battle between the legislature who passed a law that made everyone who was an Uber driver and a contractor into an employee. Now the Uber and Lyft have filed a referendum to overturn that legislation, and the battle goes on and forth, and there's no space for discussion or compromise. So what was the outcome of that particular Uber discussion, and what did the government do as a result of the citizen deliberation on that?
Yes. So I talked about the consensus. The agenda at the time was that everybody is happy about the fact that taxi no longer needed to be painted yellow. So that's an unlikely consensus, but it's a consensus. If you call it through app, of course, it doesn't need to be painted any particular color. The plates are a different color, though. And also, people understood, regardless of whether they're Uber drivers or taxi drivers, that they need to compete on fair grounds. And so that means insurance, fair insurance, and also fair registration. That is to say, high-end taxis are free to operate. So the innovations by Uber, such as surge pricing and so on, are fine. But they don't undercut existing meters, because the meter is the basis of fairness, and that's fine. And app-based dispatch systems are, of course, fine. So as long as they're registered, their insurance is taken care of, the competition is fair, people are happy with that. And the result is that we put that into legislation. And Uber threatened to quit for a couple months, but because the consensus, the norm, was pretty strong, as was the case when we negotiated with Facebook about transparency in advertisements for political issues during the election. We see the same pattern, because the social norm here is so strong that they don't have much other choice than just register, like in Uber's case, as a local fleet. So I just took the Uber today, actually, and they're now the Q taxi. They're a taxi fleet of its own. And existing taxi fleets, including companies and co-ops, are also now free to take advantage of the surge pricing and no longer need to be painted yellow and other more dynamic meter choices.
So to be real clear, was the legislature or the parliament bound to take up the recommendations, or did they just do it because it was a consensus? I mean, the consensus is what leads the legislature to say, we should do this because that's clearly what people want.
Yeah, in Taiwan, we have a system where the administration prepares the draft for the legislature to pass the draft. And the administration operates in a largely nonpartisan space. I mean, in the cabinet, there's more independent ministers, including me, than members of any particular party. So we work in a place where we can be accountable to not just our constituents, but also future generations when we talk about environmental impact and so on. Of course, the party dynamics is at play. There's 4 parties, major ones, in the parliament right now. But when we show that we have handled the discovery and define phase, if you think in design thinking terms, when we have proven that we have discovered the stakeholders and defined a common value, of course the parliament can work on the issues to make it more coherent with other legislations, or it may design a very heavy penalty and so on. That's entirely their purview, but it makes sure that the draft that we post out to the parliament have the support of the social norm, and that's our main contribution. So the parliament is not bound to pass exactly as the consensus has written, but the administration is bound to give a response and like point by point, and also hold a multi-stakeholder forum.
So would you say that this process works as well for, I wouldn't call the Uber thing a small issue, but for really controversial issues? Like, I remember there was a initiative on, when Taiwan got the Citizens Initiative, if I remember correctly, there was a ballot measure for same-sex marriage, and it failed at the public vote. There were two. So I guess my question is, on that kind of controversial issue, does this process work as well?
Yes, definitely. The participation officers, that is to say, people dedicated to talk to hashtags in each and every ministry, are specialized in tackling this kind of issues. The point is not actually to convince people. The point is to make sure that people who have attended the deliberative sessions can make those feelings of reaching a rough consensus and take them back to their communities to increase the R value, so to speak, of the ideas worth spreading. Because at the end of the day, that is what's needed for each and every citizens' assembly, for each and every sortition. If the consensus reached doesn't spread, it doesn't make any impact on the society.
Right.
And so the participation officers make sure, for example, when the people who are for marriage equality and for people who are more into this traditional value of marriages between two families, and individuals who met are just representatives of the families. So a individualistic view and a family-to-family view on marriage, that was the main contention point in the referenda that you just pointed out.
Yep.
But we made sure, using the theory of overlapping consensus, we can invite them to talk about, for example, what about the legislation to give the right of artificial reproduction to women that have not entered into a heterosexual marriage. And at that time, when we deliberated about this issue, there was no marriage equality law. So essentially, it's talking about single mothers. And the people who attended from both actually come to see eye to eye and agree on a rough consensus that we need to prepare the society so that it's in the best interest of the children that is born into a not traditional family-to-family family to enjoy the same opportunity and free from discrimination. That's the kind of value that both sides do agree on. And at the end of the day, when we legalized marriage equality, we made a special act nicknamed the Hyperlink Act. And it hyperlinks to the parts of civil code that pertains to the bylaws, the rights and duties, but not the in-laws. So when two same-sex couples wed, they form the same rights and duties relationship, but their families do not magically become in-laws as heterosexual couples do. And so that took both sides' positions, created a common value, innovated to deliver the common value. And I think it's actually a very good illustration of how deliberation is not just to reach compromise, but it's reaching innovation. And hashtag officers or participation officers, that's their real job name, can get very creative as well. For example, the Ministry of Health and Welfare's participation officer lives with this cute dog named Song Chai. And for each and every health measure that we roll out, for example, physical distancing.
Audrey, I'm sorry, Audrey, I'm sorry to interrupt. sorry, Audrey, I'm sorry
Sure.
to interrupt you, but we've lost our time. We're out of it, but I
Oh,
think,
we did.
yeah, I think we, just getting to the interesting part, but I mean, it was all interesting. But, thanks so much, and you're totally on the frontiers of digital democracy, and we're all looking towards you as a template for the rest of us. So thanks so much, Audrey.
Thank you. And what I shared could be Googled under the term humor over rumor. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Live long and prosper.